think we're recording. Did you get a recording announcement?
I didn't. Oh, there it is. Recording has started.
Okay. Well, welcome, Gary. Gary, I'm very excited for you to be joining us this morning and talking with us a little bit more about the role of committees and teams when it comes to the life of the church. But before we begin, maybe just say a few words about yourself and your experience, especially working in the governance and development area in churches.
Sure. Currently, I work at the United Methodist Foundation of Michigan, Senior Director of Leadership Development. Prior to that, so I've only been here less than a year at the foundation, but prior to that, I worked on conference staff in revitalization. So I worked with many churches going through the process of trying to revitalize, trying to understand how to really overcome their culture. A lot of churches are stuck in that culture. And some of the things we're talking about today helps, move through that culture. So I have 10 years plus experience in helping churches try to, capture vision and mission and put that in the driver's seat, really. And it takes time. And, as we talk about committees and teams, this is part of the process.
Well, let's start with that. Let's
Sure.
just start with a higher level overview of how would you work with churches and congregations and describe some of the differentiators between committees and teams?
Well, committees, actually, they sound boring, don't they? You want to be on a committee. That's the first thing that I bring up is, who wants to be on a committee? Not everybody's excited about that. But some people really understand the committee is for oversight. It's usually found in administrative parts of the church, right? So with oversight, the committees are setting boundaries, like budgets, and the council kind of overseeing the ministry. You have that representative model, so all those people are coming to that meeting, right? And the problem, with the representative model is everybody's trying to protect their piece of that meeting. So it's one of the downfalls of our council is we have all these different parts of the church representing them. And what happens is, with committees, you have term limits. And if you don't adhere to the term limits, and you talk about churches, that the downfall is when they don't adhere to the term limits, what happens is the people take ownership in that area. For instance, trustees, they feel like they're in charge of caring for that building no matter what, rather than supporting the ministry of the church to do ministry, right? And then the finance is the same way, with committee work, you're supporting ministry, but then you forget that the longer you work in that area and you begin to take control, thinking like the finances are yours, you're supposed to protect the finances of the church. So then what happens is in committees is they start to lose their function, especially administrative committees, because then they start to silo up and feel like they need to control that area rather than support of ministries, right? And so they, and I think also administrative committees in a lot of our churches, especially United Methodist churches, and I think others too, it becomes their ministry. When I've done interviews in churches, they say, where have you participated in ministry in the church? And they always talk about the administrative roles that they held. And seldom do they talk about actually the ministry that they have done. So one of the things I did when I was a pastor is I had people serve in ministry first before they could serve administratively to help them understand that they're the support staff for the ministry itself. So there is a place for committees when they do good oversight and they understand that they are there to support the ministries, the vision, and the mission of the church.
I think that's good. I like the idea of framing it as sort of a support staff role.
Yeah.
I think that's a helpful frame.
Mm-hmm.
And also, in discussing the role of administrative committees, how do you differentiate that from teams and ministry teams? What's the difference there?
And it's some people say it's semantics, but it's totally not. Okay, when you move to the team approach, teams are more casual. They don't have a strict schedule of meeting. It's more about passion. It's more about spiritual gifts for that ministry, that calling. It's a group of folks that get together that are passionate about that particular ministry, like mission and outreach or evangelism, and they're getting together and they're excited about where they're going. So they're created to do the ministry of the church. Oversight might be the pastor or the staff. Alignment would be, does it fit with the vision and mission of the church? So that's the committee work, right? Okay, they're trying to align everything. Once the teams get a green light, they get budgets, they get support, and then they can kind of fly in their ministry. And it's the team approach is similar to sports, right? You're all on this team, you're excited about where you're going. What happens is, or the shift that happened in our church was, we used to have committees like a mission committee, a committee for evangelism. And what happened was, in nominations, we were trying to fill, right, a chair or this particular committee, right, with people, warm bodies, just to fill out our structure. But what happens with a team is, hey, then it's an invite. Do you want to be on this team? Do you want to do this ministry? Do you want to serve in this food pantry? And so there's some excitement around it. And you don't have to beg people to serve there. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so the team is more passionate. It's more directed. It's a calling. So one example I had was when I was a pastor and we were moving our missions committee, right? We were trying to find a person to chair the committee because the last person was fired up and passionate about it. And we found that, that whole committee was just like, we don't want to do this ministry really, And so we were just trying to fill warm bodies. I completely eliminated the missions team for 3 years in our church until God raised up a passionate person to do missions. Oh my gosh, the difference was incredible. She put together this whole team. They went to Africa, built an orphanage. We raised, in a smaller church, raised like $10,000 to do that. We started a backpack program at the school, started feeding kids. Why? Because we had a passionate person that was called by God to do the work of ministry. And that's the difference. That's the kind of shift a lot of churches have done and need to continue to do, to have those people passionate in that area.
But are you saying, Gary, that both are necessary in the life of the church? I mean, I don't think you're not saying that you shouldn't have committees and teams. It's just helpful to frame them a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think the understanding of what their function is, okay? When you understand the function of oversight as a committee and supporting the ministry of the church, all the committees need to do that. So when you go to ask finance for interest, we want to do this ministry and it's going to cost this much money. Usually the answer is, we don't have the money to do that, right? Yeah. And so in terms of vision and mission, it's like, oh, that fits our vision and mission. It sounds like you're passionate about that. Let's try to find those dollars. Let's create those dollars to do that ministry. That's the difference, right? When the committees understand that they're undergirding, they're helping the folks to do ministry. One is like screens in the church, right? How many roadblocks have we had in so many churches to put up screens, right? You're going to ruin our walls. You're going to ruin the sanctuary. You're going to, but it's nothing about the mission of the church and what it's trying to accomplish. Why are we doing this? It's the why behind it, rather than all the resistance, right, to change. And so actually it lowers the resistance to change when everybody's on the same, vision and accomplishing the mission of the church. Not that screens are going to transform everything, but you don't need to put those roadblocks up, right? they're usually not asking the right questions, is what I'm saying. That makes sense.
It absolutely does. And so for the ministry leaders who might be watching this, I'm sure the question is, okay, this makes sense, right? Understanding committees in a support function and teams, especially as it relates to ministry teams being about the mission of the congregation. How, though, can a leader, especially those people who are in this program, how can they frame this up and help to train and develop their committee members so that they understand and say yes to this idea of my role being one in which supports the mission? And it shouldn't be an always no, but an always yes, and or we'll make a way. Like, how do they transform and enable that kind of change so that there's a better understanding of the role and purpose and function of that committee as it relates to vision and mission?
Isn't that a great question? Oh my goodness. So it takes about, your people are not going to want to hear this stat, right? It takes 4 to 7 years to change the culture of a church. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't shift in that time, but it takes a long time for the church to transform the current culture. If the current culture is in decline, if the current culture is stuck, if the decision making is around relationships and about each other and about who you're going to offend, right? Then that's when you're bumping against culture. So if you look at the life cycle of the church, it actually depends on where you're at on the life cycle, how long you've lingered on the downside, or if you're moving to the upside. So what happens is, if you've lingered too long on the downside, there's too many folks in the church that really have lost why the church exists, has lost the mission and vision. So what I do there, Alisha, is start at the beginning. And I just get a group of leaders in the room and I ask the question, why does the church exist? Why are we here? And we start in right at the end of Matthew, to go and make disciples. So we have a hard conversation of what does it mean to make disciples? What does it mean for a church, right, to be out there transforming lives? What I'm finding is the church wants to be disciples, but they don't want to make disciples. You hear that?
Yeah.
They want to be disciples, they don't want to make disciples. So I would suggest to the leaders to begin at that point, depending on where they're at in the life cycle, to start to, and believe it or not, I've seen rooms actually light up when I talk about this. What is the true mission and vision of the church? And then we start to talk about what does it mean to make a disciple, right? I always say it sounds like you're baking a cake or something. They don't just, you can't just bake one up. So what does it mean to be in relationship with other people? What does it mean to share your story with other people? How do we move our mission work, the work we're doing right now, to be less transactional? We're doing ministry to somebody rather than doing ministry with somebody, getting to know their name, getting to know their story. So that's where I start. And that begins to transform. Leaders need to know why the church exists. What does it mean for the mission of the church? And what does it mean for the vision? In other words, how do we do ministry here?
Yeah, and I think what I hear you saying is kind of a natural trajectory here for this approach, where you start with the why and why do we exist.
Yeah.
And I think we hear that a lot. But to take it to the next level, as it relates to a committee in the congregation, it's okay, we understand our why. And now we can even take it a step further, that next layer. Now, why does this committee exist?
Right.
And if you can get to that level, why does this committee exist? Then it's easier to answer, how do we need to, because of why we exist, then these are the ways that we can support our church, our ministry teams, and then not losing sight of that. And I think that's probably helpful, and something perhaps, and I could be wrong, but perhaps a lot of churches maybe don't get to that level. They don't get to that level of, all right, now in this particular committee, how do we connect to that broader vision and mission, and how do we do and execute the work that we're assigned to in order to make that happen? Is that a fair assumption?
That is very fair. And so you also want to make sure that as you're raising up those leaders, they understand. We have put a lot of people in place in leadership positions that don't really understand. Maybe we put them in finance because they understand money, right? But they don't understand the why. So it's making sure your key leaders understand the why, right? I think that's the first step. And then that kind of spreads to the rest of the team. Then that person will get together, either a committee or a team, and help them understand. That will be the first thing out so another thing in the committee meetings is talking about the vision and the mission of the church, no matter what meeting it is. Yeah. That's really helpful.
Starting there already making that an emphasis of those session that you have, meeting that you have, I think is good. We only have a couple minutes left, Gary, but sure. Any other practical tips or advice that you could give to our ministry leaders when it comes to framing and or training these committees and or ministry teams as they go about their work?
I think the last thing I found was just having a good agenda helps really committees stay on track. But once you have an agenda, then you can set that tone about how you're going to start, and then holding people accountable and holding yourself accountable to the mission and vision of the church. It's actually called accountable leadership. And so I created found some meeting templates that were very helpful. So if you make a decision within one of your committee meetings, it's like, you first start with prayer, but then you go to the vision and mission, and then if you make decisions during that meeting, who do you need to contact? I actually did had my people doing emails right after the committee meeting. It's like, you said you were going to do this, so it's holding people accountable too. I think in the church world, we don't hold people accountable in those meetings. We talk a lot, but we don't follow up a lot. So I think follow up is key. And some meeting templates can really help with that.
Any helpful tips for our ministry leaders when it comes to holding people accountable? I know that can be awkward for them sometimes. Like how do they better assert their authority and or keep people accountable? What are some tips that you might have in that space?
So I think accountability depends on where they're at in the leadership of the church. So I think there's different layers of accountability. If somebody has said yes to a higher position in the church, then you hold them more accountable, right? As they serve God, as they understand them, where they're serving in the church. And so I always hear this, well, they're just, volunteers. Well, they're not volunteers. I have dismiss people from their volunteer position because they did not say what they were, said that they would do, right? So we just have hard conversations. You don't do that right away. You don't come down heavy. You give them a lot of grace and mercy, but you still hold them accountable. And if you do what I talked about, the next meeting, the first thing on the agenda is following up. Hey, Bob or Sue, you said you were going to do this. How is that going? And if it's not going well, how can we help you?
Sure.
That I have found extremely helpful.
Yeah. And I think when it comes to culture, and I know that you talk a lot about culture,
yes.
Once you can kind of institutionalize and normalize those conversations, those accountability mechanisms, building in some of those, just a simple thing like an agenda shift.
Yes.
Once people get used to it, it doesn't become scary or it reduces conflict. There's a lot of positive that can come with those slow and simple.
Yeah, so I've experienced this myself. You become ready. It's like, oh my gosh, I said I was going to do that, so I need to get that done. So it can actually be a very positive. and motivate you, knowing that that meeting's coming up and that question's going to be asked.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Gary, I want to close our time together just by saying thank you for illustrating some of the differences here, and I hope that the scholars who are tuning in, that this helps illuminate a few things for them, and maybe they can walk away with a tip or two that they can start applying and implementing in their ministries as well. So thank you so much. And I'm going to stop the recording here, and I'll stay with you for a few minutes after. Thank you.